Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psychedelicast. My name is Zach. I will be the host on this crazy journey into the unknown. Today's podcast is brought to you by the universe. What a beautiful and wonderful one it is, and how lucky we are to be here. I want to first thank each and every one of you for tuning in, whether you're watching or listening. I truly appreciate everybody's time. This will be the first of many informative and interesting conversations with some truly amazing people. We're going to have scientists, doctors, artists, musicians, journalists, and other well-educated and extremely talented people on this podcast in the months and years to come. One of the main goals of this podcast is to help educate and inform people on how to use these psychedelic tools and medicines safely and in a proper context. But as you'll come to know, we'll also be discussing some current events and things not directly associated with the psychedelic experience. I would like everyone to know that I do support the use of these psychotropic compounds and substances, but I support the informed use in a safe manner. As Dr. Timothy Leary said, set and setting being two of the most important components when taking any mind-altering substance or any substance at all, for that matter. Intent is another really important factor for anyone who's trying to have the best possible experience. I believe that if one takes these psychedelics seriously and does them in a proper context, there is a lot to be learned and a lot to bring back from these experiences. But it is also okay to merely have fun. Just please do so safely. My best advice for anyone wanting to try these things, either for the first time or in a serious manner, would be to surround yourself with people you're extremely comfortable with in a really safe environment, and preferably with at least one person who has some experience on how to navigate these altered states of consciousness. I also support things like ayahuasca tourism and shamanism in places like South America. Shamanism, as many of you may know, has been a practice that's been ongoing for thousands and thousands of years. So perhaps one should start there if that's at all feasible. As with all mind-altering substances, preparation and safety are the key. Contrary to popular belief, however, most of these psychedelic plants and tools have little to no toxicity. In fact, recent evidence has shown things like magic mushrooms to be less dangerous when compared to alcohol and other recreational and even pharmaceutical drugs. I must also state that most of these psychedelics are currently illegal to possess, ingest, or sell in the United States of America, as well as many other countries. So please educate yourself on the laws in your area first. This podcast is not responsible for what anyone decides to do. We merely want to help educate people because illegal drugs will be used regardless. We all know that. But if we can help educate and inform the younger generation on how to use these things safely and wisely, maybe we can see a change in the laws like we're currently seeing with cannabis. We also must keep an open discussion as it pertains to these things to get them into the hands of the people who truly need them, or anyone that's just looking to explore his or her own consciousness, which is a human right on this earth, no matter what anybody tells you. For too long, there's been entirely too much misinformation relating to psychedelics, and hopefully this podcast can help clear up some of the propaganda that has been spread throughout the years. I encourage everyone to comment on the comment section of this podcast. And we'd like to welcome today's first guest, who really needs no introduction whatsoever. His name is J McKenna. Dr. McKenna is currently the assistant professor in the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota. His research is focused on the interdisciplinary study of Amazonian ethnopharmacology and plant hallucinogens. He has conducted extensive ethnobotanical fieldwork in the Peruvian, Colombian, and Brazilian Amazon, recently completing a 4-year project investigating Amazonian ethnomedicines as potential treatments for cognitive disorders and schizophrenia. His doctoral research at the University of British Columbia focused on the ethnopharmacology of ayahuasca and ukuhe, two tryptamine-based hallucinogens used by indigenous peoples in the Northwest Amazon. Dr. McKenna completed postdoctoral research fellowships in neurosciences in the Laboratory of Clinical Pharmacology, National Institute of Mental Health, and in the Department of Neurology at the Stanford University School of Medicine. He joined Shaman Pharmaceuticals as Director of Ethnopharmacology in 1990 and subsequently joined Aveda Corporation as Senior Research Pharmacognosist. He is a founding board member of the Hefter Research Institute, where he continues to his focus on the therapeutic uses of psychoactive medicines derived from nature and used in indigenous ethnomedical practices. He was also a key organizer and participant in the Ayahuasca project, the first biomedical investigation of ayahuasca used by the UDV, a Brazilian religious group. Dr. McKenna is author or co-author of 3 books and over 40 scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals. And as many of you may know, Dennis is also one of the original psychedelic pioneers, an extremely humble scientist, and of course the brother of the late great Terence McKenna, who was well known as a psychedelic guru of sorts in the 80s and 90s, and a man whose legend continues to live on well over a decade after his death, especially on the internet. Together with his brother Terence, Dennis has been extremely helpful in educating people on how to use these psychedelic plants and substances safely, and also retelling some amazing stories and journeys. The McKenna brothers also wrote one of the first ever books on how to grow your own mushrooms at home, entitled Psilocybin, Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, a Handbook for Psilocybin Enthusiasts, which was originally published in 1975. This was at a time where mushrooms weren't that well known by the masses, especially the psychedelic variety. But this book detailed things in a manner with such ease that an 8th grade student, for example, would be able to grow these things with little to no experience at home. There are currently a lot of books and guides now on different methods, but I still suggest people check this book out as it was one of the first of its kind. And along with all that, Dennis is one of my personal influences, one of my favorite authors, and one of my major inspirations in this journey we call life. It was truly an honor and a privilege to conduct this podcast with such an extremely talented, interesting, and well-credentialed person. I consider myself really lucky, and I greatly appreciate Dr. McKenna's time. I also encourage everyone to check out his work and his books, especially his newest book, which is called The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, My Life with Terence McKenna. It's a story of family, chemistry, psychedelic plants, adventures in the Amazon jungle, shamanism, among many other things. A really interesting book, to say the least. I highly recommend it to everyone, even if you're not particularly interested in trying psychedelics yourself. I still believe everyone can gain a great deal from this book, and just as important, it's a hilarious tale of sibling rivalry, crazy adventures, and growing up in a time period so much different than our current one. You can get this book on Dennis's website, brotherhoodofthescreamingabyss.com, or off of Amazon.com. Signed hard copies of the book are also available through Dennis's website. After this podcast is over, please head over to hefter.org. That's HEFFTER.org to learn more about the Hefter Research Institute, where they're currently conducting some really interesting studies. They're similar to MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. MAPS' main focus is MDMA for things like post-traumatic stress disorder and war vets and similar studies, whereas the Hefter Research Institute mainly focuses on using psilocybin for the treatment of anxiety and depression in cancer patients, as well as the treatment of alcohol or addiction to alcohol and smoking. They also, at the Hefter Research Institute, continue to focus on the basic science of consciousness, using psilocybin as a tool to correlate conscious experience with brain function. A really interesting institute, really interesting website. Please check it out. There will be links for everything we've discussed in the comment section of this podcast, at the home of this podcast, psychedelicast.com. That's psychedelicast.com. This entire journey, this entire podcast is dedicated to my friend and mentor, Robert Hoogterp. I miss Hoopy like crazy, and every single day his memory lives on. He was one of the first people that showed me what these things were all about, and I could not thank him enough, and I miss him a great deal. But this is dedicated to you, Hoop. Without further ado, we're proud to present Psychedelicast, a conversation with Dr. Dennis McKenna. Push record here. All right. Welcome to Psychedelicast here with Dennis McKenna. First of all, I want to start out by asking you a little bit about your early childhood. You grew up in Paonia, Colorado, which is not too far from where I'm at. What was the population at that time? Do you remember?
The population was about the same as it is now, which is roughly 1,500 people.
Okay.
If you count all the outlying mesas.
Right.
You know, in town, it's maybe 500 people.
Okay. What would you say the advantages or the disadvantages were of growing up somewhere like that for you?
Well, I didn't appreciate the advantages at the time when I grew up there. I thought it was all disadvantage. I thought it was the armpit of the universe. I mean, I had to grow up before I appreciated what a nice place it was, and oddly enough, I ended up living in a town that was a little smaller than Paonia, this place in Minnesota called Marine on St. Croix.
Oh.
That I lived for 22 years. We just moved into St. Paul from there.
And St. Paul's much bigger, huh?
Well, St. Paul's, the Twin Cities, so Minneapolis, St. Paul, yeah, big city.
Okay. Well, my experience was a little similar to yours, and where I'm at now is population of about 800, and it's always remained the same, and I hated it growing up. There was nothing to do. I mean, the lake and things like that, but now that I'm older and grown, I appreciate it much, much more, But you had mentioned that some of the magazines that your father would bring home.
Where are you?
I'm in La Veta, Colorado, is where I'm at. I'm actually in the outlying, about 5-6 miles away from there. But and then the next closest town is Walsenburg, which has about 2,000 people. But it's just a really small community. But La Veta, where I grew up and went to high school, was nothing but people that raised cattle, and nobody really, there was no diversity. We didn't have any African Americans. I was one of the only Hispanic kids.
We didn't.
In Borrego, and so it was hell as far as that went. I was a basketball player, and I felt like I was almost crucified for my last name being from there. But it's changed over the years, and it's gotten a little more diverse. So I can't complain. I love it, and it's a safe place to raise kids. I don't have to keep both eyes on my daughter 100% of the time, such as when
So it's in Colorado? It's a small town in Colorado? Okay.
Really close to the border of New Mexico. We're about maybe 80 miles from the border of New Mexico. Right in the Spanish Peaks country. When you had mentioned that you flew with your dad, you probably flew through some of this area if you went by Mesa Verde or the...
Yeah, we used to fly down to Mesa Verde on weekends because we could do that with the plane. We could actually go to these places, and Durango, Silverton, in that area, Ouray, which is, none of that is that far from Paonia. I mean, Paonia's roughly an hour, maybe an hour and a half out of Ouray.
Okay.
Or Montrose, if you know Montrose.
Yes.
That is pretty close.
Is Ouray the place that has the hot springs?
It is,
okay.
Yeah.
I have been there before, but it's been so many years, I don't even remember. What would you say was your biggest influence in what the studies you became and the man that you are now? You mentioned that your dad used to bring home some magazines. Would you attribute that as one of them? And if so, what were some of those magazines?
Well, that was a big influence, on both Terrence and myself at the time. Basically, he used to bring home Fate magazines sometimes, and different science fiction magazines, and those pulp science fiction mags that you could buy back then, like fantasy and science fiction. I think Asimov's science fiction. There was a range of these, pulp magazines that had basically short stories in them. And then Fate magazine, which was also, that was a big influence, paranormal, UFOs.
You mentioned Fate. Is that...
Yetis, all that. Not so much about psychedelics, but all about mysteries.
Right. You mentioned Fate, I don't know, a couple years ago on a podcast as still being pressed. Is that still true to this day?
Fate magazine?
Yes.
Yes, it's still being published, and it turns out that it's not far from here. Actually, the publisher is in, I think, a town close to where I used to live.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's still being published. It's a pretty low-key thing, but they approached me a few years ago. Probably about 10 years. No, not that long. Maybe 2005. They were doing a special issue on something, on peyote, on some psychedelic theme.
Uh-huh.
So they asked me to write an article for them, which I did. So I can send that to you if you want.
Yes, I'd always be interested in reading that. Just a little bit more about your childhood. You grew up as a Catholic, correct?
Yes.
And how was your lack of religion? Or, because reading your book, it seems like you kind of drew away from that. What was your influence?
I don't know if there was ever any one moment where I just said, okay, I'm done with this. I actually, in the book I talk about, there was one priest, who was basically abusive in a certain sense.
Uh-huh.
But I was so clueless, I didn't even know I was being abused, by him. And that wasn't really the reason I left the church. I left the church because, you reach a certain point when around 12 or 13 when you begin to see through it all.
Right.
And it doesn't make any sense. And so you keep asking these questions, and they keep saying, you must be a bad person because you keep asking these questions.
Right.
And I don't know. I want to know. These are reasonable questions. And it's like, and I guess a big factor in what made me leave the church was when we found out, well, partly it was my brother, right? Because he was 4 years older than I am. And so he rejected the church before I did. And that was a big influence. And I was actually a pretty good Catholic. I bought into it. I was an altar boy and all that. But these questions kept coming up, and they didn't really have good answers for them. And then I found out that there was an index of forbidden books. The Vatican, has an index of forbidden books, right? I found out about that, and I found out what was on that list, and it wasn't like pornography or anything. It was philosophers and people like that, Nietzsche and Kant and Spinoza, these kinds of people. So I immediately went out and read all the forbidden books I could get my hands on, and that was pretty much it. There was just a certain point where, it just didn't do anything for me. It felt like it was pro forma.
And your parents were okay with that? They didn't try pushing you back into it, or?
Well, no. My parents were not extremely religious. My mom converted to Catholicism, so she was not Catholic, but actually, the converts are more into it than the natives. So when she did convert, she was quite a good Dogon. My dad was a Catholic all his life and went to church every Sunday and so on. But it's not like it. There was no point where we were reached where I said, no, I'm not going. I actually went to church until I graduated, until I left high school. I didn't fight him on it. It's just that it didn't mean anything.
Okay. Well, some of the reason I ask this is because I have a 12-year-old daughter. I know you have one daughter of your own, correct? And, her mom,
27 now.
Her mom and her mom's side of the family are a lot more religious, but she asks me some of these questions, and, I'm honest with her that I stopped believing in any of those teachings. A lot like you, I found books and I found things that the church didn't have for me. Getting on to more of the psychedelic thing, what would you say was the experience that made you, you described in your book that kids like to spin around and be disoriented, and that's just kind of a childhood thing, or maybe even a human mind thing. You referenced a book by Wheel, The Natural Mind. and where he talks about that. But what would you say the experience was where you knew that you were brave enough, I guess I would say, to try some of these substances that, especially during your time, weren't well known?
Well, I was a teenager in the 60s, right? So I was born in 1950. So my teenage years in the 60s were exactly synced together. And right. Terrence was 4 years older, and he was definitely an envelope pusher. And he was, out in California. He left Paonia 2 years before he graduated from high school. I mean, he left Paonia and went to California. He just drove my parents crazy because he wanted to get out of Paonia so bad that he just basically didn't let them rest. And finally, they agreed to let him go finish high school. So that was interesting for me because then he was kind of, I was getting postcards from the edge, as it were, and both the edge of the country and the cultural edge of the times. He wanted to go there because he was so immersed in the counterculture. As soon as he got out to the Bay Area, to Menlo Park, where he lived with my aunt and her husband, who were school teachers out there. So then he immediately fell in with the strangest people he could find.
Right. And
psychedelics were happening. People were experimenting with these things, and so, so he would come back with these tales of, and by the time all this happened, we'd sort of evolved beyond the point of sibling rivalry. That was all, there was plenty of that when we were younger, but by this time we were more like just friends and colleagues, and we found a lot of mutual interests. And so, but he definitely took the lead, and I was sort of, following along. Just like it was when we were younger,
Right.
Do you have any siblings? Do you have any brothers?
I have an older brother. He is 6 years older than me, and a younger sister that's 6 years younger than me. And
so you understand how this works, right?
I've been telling a lot of people, Dennis, to read the book, even if they're not really into psychedelics, even if they just have a sibling, because the sibling rivalry on its own, the story you told about Terrence telling you he was standing above you waiting to tickle you, and some of the stories that were in there I related to a lot, because my brother tortured me until the point where I was big enough to swing back, basically.
Yeah, and that's basically what happened to me too. So that's, and I don't know how it was with your brother, but my brother was always into stuff, whatever it might be. He was the producer, director, and star of his own movie, and I wanted in because I was the younger brother, and, younger brothers tag along and they want to get in on whatever the older brother's doing. A lot of times he just shooed me away, but sometimes not. And so, and then that gradually changed, and I think we developed a certain mutual respect, for each other, because he was out there, he was doing his thing, but I was back in Paonia, kind of holding down the fort, if you will, right. And sharing a lot of our mutual interests and so on. So then when I went to, Terrence came back from Berkeley, his first semester at Berkeley in the summer of '66, and he brought some cannabis with him. And he brought cannabis and his new girlfriend with him. And so, that summer was really the summer when I, began my life on the road to perdition, I guess you could say.
Right.
We just went across the street into the and sat down and smoked cannabis. And that was my first real introduction to any of these things. And then the next summer, which was the summer of love, '67, I went out to Berkeley, where Terrence I'm baffled in a certain sense, because he knew that crazy stuff was going on, but for some reason he didn't absolutely forbid it.
Right.
So we went out there, and then in that summer I had my first LSD trip in Berkeley, which was impactful enough, but then I brought goodies back with me. Right.
Had you used cannabis a multitude of times before LSD, or?
Not very many times.
Okay. Also,
a little bit, a few times. I didn't really have that much.
Before we skip over cannabis here, you had mentioned in the book about how it's kind of a learned process. A lot of people describe to me the first few times they smoke or even try to eat it that they don't really get high per se, because they don't really know what to expect, I guess.
Right.
You had a similar experience with ayahuasca that you had told me, but we'll get to that. The thing with cannabis is that, what do you think that is? What is your speculation on what that is? Is it our endocannabinoid receptors learning how to process this chemical, or is it just a mental thing to where you don't really know what to expect?
Yeah, I think it's more like I don't really think it's a neurochemical adaptation. Uh-huh. I think you get this with a lot of drugs, especially with cannabis and psychedelics and even other drugs. All in a sense, these things are active placebos.
Right.
They put you into an altered state. It takes a little bit of learning to figure out what is that altered state. What is this all about? So I think it's a learned skill. It took me 3 or 4 times of smoking cannabis. I remember that summer with my brother, and it was really not until the 4th time that was like, oh, I get it now. Now I understand what it's supposed to do.
Right. Okay.
And I really think that goes on a lot.
Yeah, you had also mentioned that your first few ones where you learned what it does were extremely psychedelic in nature. I mean, you patterns on blankets, and I had similar experiences. Is there a way where you can get back to that state? Like, if you stopped using cannabis for 5 years, do you think that you can get back to that early state of,
potentially, yeah. Potentially you could get back to it, to some degree, but I don't think you could ever get back to it to the, same degree as the first time.
Right.
It's simply a situation of you're only a virgin once.
Right.
And you may forget what it's like, but not really,
Right.
You might be abstinent for 20 years, but the next time you make love, you have remembered what it was like the first time. And I think that's the way it is. I think a lot of these things are really about, with these psychedelics, it's really about learning how to use these substances to navigate. This was really, this was really the thing with DMT. You asked me what impacted us most. Well, for both Terrence and me, it was definitely DMT. And there wasn't much DMT around. It was rare, but he was well wired into the matrix, and it came up. It was there, and we both agreed that it was, not just the most interesting drug we'd ever taken. It was by far the most interesting thing that we'd ever run across, and we thought, wow, this is incredible. How can we ignore this? How can we not go completely into this? And one of the frustrations with DMT that we had was that it's so short. You can't come back with much. All you can do is come back with this sense of astonishment and what the fuck was that? That's all you can do. And so that was really our motivation to go to try and find an orally active form of DMT. We thought that it might last longer, and hence we could kind of get used to that place. We could get our sea legs, if you will, and get more out of it.
Okay, and that you found the orally active version by Schulte's paper, correct?
That's right.
Where did you locate the paper? Because at this time there was no Google, there was no internet, right? I mean,
yeah, there was no. I don't remember exactly how we located that paper, but at the time I was in the university, so we had access to the libraries, and we were collecting information, because we were planning to go down to South America at some point. We didn't really know why. We just knew that we had to go. And then I stumbled on this paper somehow. I'm not sure how it came to my attention. Oh. And, that in the title, it was Virola as an orally active hallucinogen. That was the title.
Right.
So I thought, bingo, this is it. As it turns out, this drug that we went looking for, called ukuhe, was not that exciting when we finally got to it. But it took us to La Chirera, which was the epicenter of the universe for these psilocybin mushrooms. And it's psilocybin that is the perfect orally active form of DMT. Right. As you know, psilocybin, I can see by the molecule on your T-shirt that the structure of psilocybin is of psilocin, really, which is the active form of psilocybin, very close to DMT.
I was going to ask you that. What, I've showed this to so many friends and, so many of my acquaintances, and everyone, without knowing anything about chemistry, can look at tryptamine, serotonin, DMT, and psilocin and see that they're all really, really similar. As a someone who dabbles in biochemistry, do you have any speculation as to why they're so similar? Is that nature's way of hey, look at me,
In a certain sense, yeah. They're simple indole alkylamines is the technical term for it. They all come from tryptophan.
Right.
Right. So if you look at that structure, compare them. Tryptophan, which is in everything. It's an amino acid that's part of protein. So all organisms, every cell, everything contains tryptophan.
Right.
And two simple steps from tryptophan will give you DMT. And, the removing the acid group, the carboxyl group, adding the methyl groups, this is accomplished by enzymes that are, again, just universal parts of basic metabolism. So potentially every cell could make DMT. Wow. And probably does, actually, to a low level. And then these other things, the simple tryptamines, are just kind of variations on the theme. If you look at DMT as the core molecule, or as the prototype molecule, all these other things are just, sort of trivial modifications of it. Like psilocin, you add a hydroxyl group at the 4 position of the indole ring. Very simple. It only differs from DMT by an oxygen and a hydrogen, but the nature of the position, because it's in that position, it makes it orally active, okay. because the nitrogen is positively charged under physiologically pH. The oxygen is negatively charged, so the nitrogen will curl up and be in proximity to the hydrogen, okay. to the oxygen.
Okay.
That protects it from MAO. The enzyme can't get in there to degrade it. Right. You probably don't want to spend a lot of time on stereochemistry here.
Right.
That's the basic idea.
One thing you did mention about DMT is how it could possibly be in everything. Everything has the ability to make it. We know that it's in our bodies, correct? Our heart, our liver, yes. Our lungs. What are there different levels of that? Has there been studies to show if people have different levels just endogenously?
Yeah, there are studies about that, because when that came up, an obvious question, throughout the 50s and 60s, the idea that, in schizophrenia research, the idea was that, or a popular idea was, the body makes some kind of psychotomimetic, which is another term for hallucinogen,
Right.
a schizogen, if you will. Some error in metabolism results in the creation of abnormally high levels of DMT or maybe some phenethylamine. It wasn't clear. It's a reasonable enough idea. The problem is that there's no consistent correlation between levels of DMT and how crazy you are.
Wow.
Really? I mean, you can't say schizophrenics have higher levels of DMT because the normal levels, there's such a wide range in levels that you can't say, this particular group of people have higher levels. It's just all over the place.
Even while one is sleeping, huh? I mean, there's not.
There has been that kind of study. But there probably are variations when you sleep. But the thing is, there's, the variables that affect it are there are so many. For example, your diet probably affects it.
Okay.
There are things one person might have a diet that's, say, rich in tryptophan-containing foods. Just trivially. So
Right.
Maybe you have more tryptamine. And if you have more tryptamine, it's a complex thing. Or other people, you're getting into some unknown areas here of pharmacology. There's the whole pharmacogenetics thing, right? Like genetically, you might have lower levels of monoamine oxidase, for example, than most people. So you would have more tryptamines because it's not being degraded. Or by the same token, you might say, well, you have an abnormally high amount of N-methyltransferase, which is the enzyme that would methylate the nitrogen of the tryptamine. Okay. So you have a higher level of that. And it doesn't mean you're abnormal. It just means you're well within the range of variation. Anyway, there is no neat correlation.
Okay. Well, because the reason I ask is I told you a little bit about my near-death experience, which I'll explain in another podcast to the listeners. But the most similar thing that I've had to it was my brief encounters with DMT and ayahuasca. The only thing that even compared to that was that. I've done LSD, hundreds of times, mushrooms hundreds of times, and I never reached that level of what the near-death experience was like. It was more similar to DMT than I felt like it should have been. But I didn't know that. I didn't know that until years later. I had not done DMT at the age of 19. It wasn't prevalent where I'm from. I had never really even heard of it. It wasn't until my later 20s that I finally tried it, and it basically brought me exactly back to the near-death state. Almost identically, the time slowing down, everything. And one of my problems with DMT is smoking it. It doesn't allow me to teach anybody else anything on how to use it, because it's pretty much like, here's the pipe, good fucking luck,
Yeah, you pretty much can't teach anybody how to use it. It is. You have to, okay, you're standing on the cliff, open your umbrella and step off. I can't explain this to you. You just have to go through it.
Right. Whereas with LSD and mushrooms and things, mescaline, things like this, it was a lot longer of an experience that I got to do on my own so many times that then I could help other people through the experience. But many people have asked me, how do I do DMT right? Well, I can tell you how to load the pipe and I can tell you how to put it to your lips, but what's going to happen?
That's about all you can do. You just have to go through it. That's right. Fortunately, most people, because it is so short, by the time anybody has time to worry about it, maybe I took too much, or maybe I'm not coming back, or all these things that come up, but by the time you even have a, that even comes up, you're already on the way down. Right? So it's like that. But the one thing where there is a correlation with all this is stress. Like DMT will be elevated under stress conditions. Wow. So, so the idea that you're dying, well, that's pretty stressful.
Right.
And being born is probably pretty stressful too. And those are the points where you would expect elevated levels of DMT. Nobody's done this. Nobody has done this work. I mean, it's very hard. It's a reasonable question to ask. Do people, when they're dying, are there elevated levels of DMT when somebody is dying? It's reasonable to suppose there are, but how do you do that experiment? I mean, how do you even obtain permission to do that kind of an experiment?
Well, I also wonder if some of these studies, even with sleeping, are, in your experience, are they not done because there's not enough funding, or because it's not?
They're not done because there's not enough funding, basically. I mean, that's a big part of it.
So that leads me to, how can the regular person help? How can someone listening to this help? I mean, other than donating out of their pocket, how can they, really try to make a change here to start to study these things, which to me and you, it sounds like, are some of the most important, interesting things in human history?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know how you do it. I mean, it's a slow process. It is possible to study these things legally under FDA protocols and all that, but they're usually directed towards some therapeutic use, I mean, depression, alcoholism, whatever, PTSD, these things you can rationalize doing clinical studies with these substances, because there's a possible benefit. So that's, and then actually, are you familiar with Rick Strassman's study with DMT?
Yeah.
So he was lucky in a certain sense because, I mean, not only did his work kind of open the door again on this research after it had been suppressed for over 20 years, but he applied to the FDA, and he didn't have a therapeutic target. He was actually doing work on melatonin and DMT and melatonin, serotonin, all the. He was doing work on pineal function. So his protocol to the FDA was just basically, we want to understand what the physiological role of DMT is. We're not saying it cures anything or it's useful for anything. We just want to understand how this thing works and how does it fit into pineal physiology and so on. So he was able to do this work from a kind of pure research point of view. But even he, had he kept up with his work, he might have done some sleep studies or something like that, but he didn't. I mean, what, you've read his book?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, so what happened was, that the reports that people were bringing back from, these high levels, high doses experiences were so, bizarre and just did not fit into his worldview at all, because he was like, I'm the doctor, you're the patient. This is very top down sort of, he's a fairly rigid person, right? And he just like, what? I can't, how am I supposed to report this, back to NIDA, alien encounters and all that. And there were many of them to him to just ignore, so finally he sent his experimental, his supplies of DMT back to NIDA and checked into a Zen monastery for 2 years. He didn't know what else to do.
Wow. And he was using intravenous DMT most of the time, correct?
He was using intravenous DMT.
Is there any difference in that and smoking it as far as length?
Well, I haven't taken it intravenously.
Okay.
But it is, no, actually it's pretty similar.
And that's just because your body senses it and says, get out of here right away. It doesn't allow too much in the brain?
It is so it's not so much that I think this is the problem, that the enzymes that make it are more or less always active, and the enzymes that break it down are always active.
Okay.
So anytime it shows up, it's going to be chopped up as soon as it appears. It's very ephemeral. That's why it very rarely, reaches the level. It very rarely reaches the level where the endogenous DMT will show an effect.
Okay.
It's only in high stress situations.
Okay.
And that's supposition. That's based on, your experience, right? This is like a near-death experience. Or you could say, had you known, you could say near-death is like DMT.
Right.
But, nobody has got a catheter in your arm, when you're dying and collecting samples to be analyzed later. It's just hard to.
Right. Yeah. The closest thing at the time I related it to was LSD. I kept asking my father if somebody, gave me LSD earlier in the night. That was the closest experience that I could relate it to at the time. Laying in ICU, I didn't know what was going on. What are the shamans in South America and the ones that you've had? Have you mentioned to them about how people smoke it, or do they have any experience with that?
They don't have any experience with that. By and large, they don't. They do know about the snuffs, and and that's another way to use it, is in the form of these different plant preparations, the Varrola snuffs and the Anadenanthera snuffs, which are which are quite potent, and they don't quite rise to the level of a full-on DMT experience, but they're definitely up there, and they're short. So, they're like DMT in that sense. Some of these shamans know about that. I have offered some shamans that I've spent time with, I've had pure DMT with me, and offered to let them smoke it. Nobody's taken me up on it, like that,
Right.
You must be a brujo. I want nothing to do with this.
They do smoke the Banisteriopsis, though, correct?
Some do.
Okay.
It's not common, but some do.
Okay, and so the reason that the DMT lasts longer in ayahuasca is just because you're inhibiting your gut with these monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and it's just allowing a constant feed of DMT into your bloodstream, or what is
Well, yeah, you change what's called the pharmacokinetics of it, right? The pharmacokinetics is the time frame of the absorption and distribution through the body and the elimination through the body. It's very it's just very stretched out, because you've got, you're going through the gut, you've got the MAO inhibited. When you smoke it, there's MAO, you smoke it through the lungs. The lungs are full of MAO, and they just basically grab it and start chopping it up as soon as they see it. So, it's just very quickly metabolized. And the lung is one of the places where you find high levels of DMT in the body, because the enzymes are there to make it.
So do people smoke MAO inhibitors to inhibit the lung MAOs and then smoke DMT? Is that feasible?
Probably people do. People try every crazy variation on this that they can, but I've never done it.
Okay. In your experience, have you
can, however, interestingly, just to complete the thought, and I talk about this in the book, we found when we were at La Chorrera, this, we were taking lots of mushrooms, right?
Right.
And we found that if you smoked Banisteriopsis on high levels of mushrooms, you got this, it would cause this episode of, it would, like, we called it vegetable television. Right. It would stimulate this visionary episode, which lasts about 20 minutes. You'd get the most beautiful visions. It would last 30 minutes, and then it would fade out. And then you could take another hit of Banisteriopsis and do it again. And you could sit there all evening and do this.
And
clearly it was activating the mushrooms.
Okay, could the same be said for Peganum harmala Syrian rue type thing? Would you be able to smoke that at the height of a mushroom trip?
You would be able, sure, it's the same alkaloids.
Okay.
Yeah.
And have you had any experience with taking these MAOs before you take the mushrooms?
Yes, I have, and that definitely works. I mean, the thing is with mushrooms, you don't need the MAOs to activate it. You know, it's perfectly orally active without that. If you do use the MAOs, it will boost it. I mean, it turns out psilocybin and psilocin, which is what we're talking about, the active form, has a couple of pathways to degradation. DMT goes through monoamine oxidase, but psilocin can be degraded through MAO or another set of enzymes that basically cleaves the ring that oxidizes that indole ring, so it turns it into a quinone or something. So it's got two ways to be degraded.
I asked that because I often experiment myself with some of these inhibitors and mushrooms. You know, as a lighter version, I had read somewhere that pure cacao, raw cacao, you know, chocolate, basically, non-alkalized chocolate, can be used as a mild source of inhibition for mushrooms. I don't remember.
Could be.
And I've tried it many times and to success. I can take 2 grams of mushrooms and it feels more like 3 grams. And I've had other people replicate this experiment with me. As far as the harmaline and harmine and, you know, the THH, do you think that there's one of those? Have you taken those by themselves, first of all?
I haven't taken them by themselves.
Have you taken just one by one with the ayahuasca preparation, or they've always all been there?
Yeah, pretty much in my own experimentation, it's always been, you know, the plants, basically. I have not taken those individual compounds, you know, and plus DMT.
Okay.
I mean, somebody should, and probably somebody has.
Well,
you know, are you aware of the Entheogen Review?
No, I'm not.
Oh, well, you should check it out. It's on the web. It's now on the web. It used to be a publication. It's called the Entheogen Review, the unauthorized, something about the unauthorized journal of visionary plants and drugs. Rather amazing. People have tried unbelievable shit, you know. I mean, fortunately, you know, and the reports are there. So if somebody's done it, you'll probably find that. I actually, you can find, and then there's Arrowwood, of course. You know Arrowwood,
yes.
right?
Yes, Arrowwood.org.
Reports there.
Definitely plug them because
I mean it's a testimony in some ways to how inherently safe these drugs are. You know, in a certain way, because people do the craziest stuff.
Right.
And yet 90%, 99% of the time they come through, you know, they're maybe a little bit sobered by it or a little, but, you know, inherently the drugs are, the tryptamines at least are not that dangerous.
Right.
You know?
Well, see, and I myself have some experimentation with harmaline and mushrooms, but when I did it, it was so weird that I was, you know, I'm trying to get more information on it before I do it again, because it made it, I mean, a similar mushroom experience at first, but then everything just got 10 times weirder than any mushroom experience I've ever had.
Really? Huh.
It was just usually the mushrooms, as you know, are creating like a dialogue. And if I sit back and pay attention, I can, you know, it's not really language, but I try to, you know, explain it to people, but it's, they tell me things. They let me know things. They, you know, I can ask questions, the dialogue. With the harmaline included in it, that dialogue was like, I felt the dissonance, I guess I would say, or something was totally confused with that dialogue. I would ask a question or I would think about thoughts, and all of a sudden I was on the totally other side of the spectrum. that's how I felt personally with Harmaline. I've never replicated the experience until I want to get more information on it before I go trying it again, because it was just strange.
Did you ever have anything similar without any inhibitor, but at a high dose of mushrooms?
I can't say that I did. I've done the total darkness. That was very odd, of course. I've done multiple light and sound deprivation trips, and they were all extremely odd. Don't get me wrong. I mean, extremely. But it seemed like, the best way I could describe it is it seemed like things were still pretty well pieced together, whereas with the Harmaline included, it was really hard to understand anything. It was hard to bring back things. It was much more of it's just really hard to describe, but much more of an intense, I would say, mushroom experience than I've ever had. And it was on a lower dose of mushrooms, so I couldn't figure out what it was. I thought maybe it was that strain of mushrooms. I, tried those. The only way is to repeat the process and see if it happens again,
Carefully.
Right.
And, keep careful notes too, like how much Harmaline were you taking, and how much?
I got a tincture, and I believe it is, it's so many milliliters. It was like 40 drops of it. I had instructions from the person who prepared the tincture on how much to take for a basic inhibition of what I was to swallow was a DMT capsule.
Right.
And I decided to try it with mushrooms the next time. So there was nobody had done it that I knew. So I took the standard dose of Harmaline, which by itself seemed to give me a little bit of wooziness, nothing outside of maybe a drink of alcohol or two.
Right. It's not very psychoactive. It's kind of sedative. And
right. And that's what I was wondering about the Banisteriopsis by itself, if you had experience with that, because some people report that it's pretty strong by itself.
I haven't really worked with it by itself, but there are reports that people do, and they get an effect from it for sure. Have you ever taken like a tincture or a tea of Banisteriopsis by itself and then 40 minutes later smoke DMT?
I have not.
Okay, well that one, it will definitely boost it.
Okay.
If you prime yourself with Harmine, with Banisteriopsis extract,
right,
wait about 30 minutes and then smoke DMT, it will be very intense and much more prolonged.
Okay.
Instead of 10 or 15 minutes, it'll be more like 40 minutes.
Okay.
At that level. So it, and it's actually great. I've also had good experience with the Ayahuasca, which is what you're talking, oral DMT plus either a beta-carboline, pure beta-carboline, or Banisteriopsis extract.
Okay.
And that, I've had really interesting Ayahuasca experiences.
Similar to ayahuasca, or what would you describe the differences there?
It's similar. It's very similar to ayahuasca, but you don't throw up, which is nice.
Okay, well, that is nice. See, like I had talked to you before, it's just I don't want to say problem, because it's not really a problem. It's just my issue with DMT is that I never can bring anything back. I go into this world, and then, like you always talk about, it's by the time I'm going to put it into language, it's like a dream. It's like waking up from a dream and trying to describe your dream. I try to keep a notepad right next to me, so as soon as I come to, I'm ready to write. But the things I write either don't make any goddamn sense at all, or one or the other. And so I'm not really with the short experiences. I didn't enjoy myself. Not that I didn't enjoy the DMT, but I definitely didn't enjoy my salvia experience. No.
Oh, yeah.
It was too short, and it was uncomfortable,
Salvia is very short. It's very bizarre. I have a very hard time relating to it, And yet, a lot of people do. It's just so fucking weird. What am I supposed to get out of this?
Right.
And yet, a lot of people do, well, not a lot, but some people actually seem to like it.
Wow, wow.
So,
Well, I want to kind of try to stay away from things that are in your book because people need to read this book. I mean, that's an important thing. They do. I've given it to my mother. I mean, even people who aren't as interested as me and you in psychoactive plants and things need to read it because it's a story about life and a story about brothers and family. But what I was going to ask you was, what's your experience with mescaline or any kind of cactus like San Pedro or Peruvian torch?
I have had a few years ago. It's been a while since I've worked with those things. I've had peyote several times and pure mescaline a number of times, and then more recently I've had Wachuma,
Right.
which is the San Pedro cactus. I took that under very bad conditions. I was basically with a brujo. That was really a horrible experience, just because of the set and setting, bad situation. But previous experiences with peyote and those things, I mean, they're really good, very enjoyable, very interesting. The problem for me is, they last so long.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you just need to set aside time to do it. That's all.
A lot of time, yeah.
I tend to be a tryptamine guy. I don't go so much for the phenethylamines.
Right.
And there is definitely a difference. There's a different character. They're more speedy, which makes sense, considering what they are. So I don't know.
I guess I've always kind of described my San Pedro tea experiences and stuff as somewhere maybe between mushrooms and LSD. Maybe somewhere in between that. Not quite as, I'd say, maybe rigid as LSD, but not quite as smooth as mushrooms. A lot more spiritual feeling too. I had, a lot more sense of spirituality. I hate that word, but it's something like that.
Mushrooms are not spiritual.
No, they are. They are definitely. But I just got the overwhelming sense of it. Mushrooms are also very easy to just get sidetracked, get in thought loops, get lost, get laughing, whereas like the cactuses were a lot more serious in their nature. You've described mushrooms many times as like little children. Well, I didn't really get that from the cactus. They were more like a spiritual teacher that was more serious. And then I described LSD to people as like a dominatrix who looks really good on her way to the bathroom, and then she comes out of the bathroom and she's got a whip ready to beat your ass,
It happens. Yeah, it's interesting how, these substances they seem to have a feminine, a masculine, or sometimes an asexual nature. I mean, ayahuasca is definitely feminine for me, not always kind, but definitely there's a grandmotherly aspect, and peyote is clearly a masculine thing, and mushrooms are kind of not really, they're asexual. They're like children in that sense, and which makes sense if you think about the way these organisms are. I mean, mushrooms are, being fungi, they're definitely, they don't even have male and female the way that we do. They have dozens of sexes,
Right. That does make sense. What would your experience with music? Because I listen to a lot of music, especially while under a psychedelic state. What do you think the music was of your time that really spurred you on? And do you listen to music when you take psychedelics?
Sometimes I listen to music. Often I don't. I tend now these days to do it in a more traditional context. So I'm listening to Icaros, or I'm with a shaman who's singing, chanting, doing rattles, doing that kind of stuff. That's the traditional ayahuasca context. I have lately been working with a sound therapist who uses, different kinds of musical technologies like Tibetan bowls atonal music, basically.
Right.
So it's not even music. I'm not sure I would call it music, but it definitely can induce altered states, this atonality stuff. He has really interesting ideas. He's a very well-educated person on the history of music and the physics of music and all this. He has some very interesting ideas on how basically the Catholic Church undermined by imposing the 12-tone scale, undermined the ecstasy, essentially, of traditional music. And anyway, that's a whole other area. But
that's interesting.
I tend to either take it in a context where singing is going on, or I take it in this intensive sound therapy environment, and sometimes take it with recorded music. But in my own explorations, I actually tend not to play music.
Okay. And do you find a large difference? You mentioned one of your experiences, which you talked about from the book, I believe, where you did ayahuasca with 500 other people. Is that correct?
Yep.
Do you notice a difference in if you do it with 500 people and 5 people?
Well, that particular time, that was with the UDV at the end of this conference, and I didn't really notice a difference because I was completely absorbed in my own experience,
Right.
And I wasn't really participating in, everyone was speaking Portuguese. I don't understand Portuguese, so I felt, I gave myself permission to just focus on what was going on inside. Wasn't really listening to the sermon or anything that was going on. And that was the episode where I had that experience with photosynthesis, which was still one of the most profound ayahuasca experiences I've ever had.
If people have not heard that or seen that, I will be posting a link to that talk that you gave on this podcast, because it is interesting. It is one of the most interesting experiences, even from someone like me who doesn't understand the botany of it all as well as you do. But even to me, it was just totally interesting. As an ethnobotanist, do you think that we will discover more psychoactive plants in the coming years? And
no doubt about it.
And what is the most recent one that's been discovered?
Well, I don't know. They're coming up all the time. It's interesting how they pop up in these unexpected places. The thing is, because the tryptamines are so common, chances are a new psychedelic may be a new psychedelic, but it may be an old compound. Chances are, like, oh God, not another tryptamine,
Right.
But some of these things are interesting. There's an interesting mushroom from China that is a bolete. So it's a boletus, if you know the kind of mushroom, the kind with pores underneath the cap instead of gills.
Right.
And a lot of boletes are quite delicious. So they're good eating mushrooms. There is this mushroom in China called the Chao Ren Ren, Xaiorenren, or some. I don't spell it
correctly. Chao Ren Ren, huh?
Chao Ren Ren, which means little person.
Okay.
And apparently, if you eat this mushroom and it's not properly cooked, or if it's undercooked, then the little people come out.
Oh, wow.
And it sounds like it could be psilocybin, but psilocybin, it can't be psilocybin, because psilocybin would not break down if you cook the mushroom.
Even at high temperatures?
Even at high, it would take a lot of boiling to make it break down. And the thing is, these mushrooms, I have not taken them, but I had a friend who went to China, who speaks Chinese, who basically went to the place where these mushrooms are, went to the mushroom markets in Yunnan province, talked to people, collected every bloody bolete he could get his hands on and stuffed it down. He got nothing.
Nothing.
No effect at all.
Wow.
And so it's a very ephemeral thing, and it's, I don't know whether it's seasonal or whether, what's going on.
Sort of like you've discussed with the Amanita muscaria mushroom, right? Yeah.
The Amanita muscaria is another example, yeah.
Because some people report that they have an amazing experience, but they grow up here in Creede, Colorado, and I've known people that say, I got nothing from it. I took a bunch, and all I felt was sick,
Yeah. So in the case of Amanita muscaria, that's probably what's going on. There are probably chemical races of it.
Okay.
And some of them have it and some of them don't. And when I say it, I'm not even sure what it is, because, the chemistry of Amanita muscaria is ibotenic acid and muscimol. Those things aren't even psychedelic. I mean, they work on GABA receptors. They work on the same receptors that kava or alcohol work on.
Right.
But then I know people who swear that if you dry the amanitas a certain way, you have to dry them. This seems to be important. If you take them, then it's a kick-ass psychedelic.
Wow.
So there's a lot left to be understood. Somebody just sent me a paper the other day, which I was not aware of, but a paper about a psychedelic lichen from South America. That turns out, what lichens are. Lichens are a combination of an algae and a fungus.
Right.
Most of the fungi in lichens are ascomycetes, but there are a few that are basidiomycetes. And so this was a psychedelic lichen that the Waorani people knew about and used. And they did some chemical analysis. They found psilocybin, 5-methoxy-DMT, and DMT in this lichen.
Wow.
And I'm not sure I believe the chemistry. It was a little bit shaky, but it definitely is, and this was a paper that was published like 20 years ago.
Well, we've never found psilocybin in anything except for the mushrooms, right?
Never found it except in the mushrooms.
Or psilocin either.
Right.
Okay.
No.
And
however, it probably was. I mean, the fungal component of this was a basidiomycete, so it could be a psilocybe of some kind.
Well, you just sent me on a journey to find this lichen because it sounds very interesting.
Well, there's plenty of evidence that there's a lot of work still to be done on this, like. Urimamine, you've heard of urimamine,
yes.
You've heard of Mimosa hostilis.
Oh, yes.
Right. Now, that's a puzzle because that one's orally active. We know it contains DMT. There is no admixture plant that's used, and yet it's still orally active. So
Mimosa hostilis is by itself?
It is orally active by itself, yeah.
Because I've drank.
So the question comes up: what is activating it? And then this new compound, urimamine, was discovered. And if you look at that compound, well, the question is maybe it's an MAO inhibitor, or maybe it's hallucinogenic in itself, or maybe it's converted to DMT. Because if you look at the structure of it, DMT is in the structure.
Okay.
And you can look at the structure and say, oh, if you cleaved it here and you cleaved it here, you'd get DMT. So maybe it's, this bigger molecule and maybe it's absorbed and then, this is entirely speculation.
Right. No, that's okay. Are you aware of any South American tribal people that use Mimosa hostilis?
Well, in eastern Brazil, it's still used. I mean, it's a traditional traditional thing called urema. Vino de urema is the name of the beverage that's made from it.
But I mean, they use it by itself.
They use it by itself.
Because I've tried it before in a tea, But I also mixed Banisteriopsis with it. I thought that I didn't know that it was active by itself. I still have some, so I'm going to...
Well, a lot of people do use the substitute mimosa for chacruna.
Right.
Or some of these admixtures, and it definitely works. But apparently, you can brew up mimosa by itself, and it works.
Wow. Do you think that using some of these different plants, I've heard, I mean, wild speculation from many people, but, such as using different plants, different DMT-containing plants, or the beta-carbolines can give you different visions? I mean, such as some people say that the mimosa will give them a darker blue or a darker green vision, and some people say that the Psychotria viridis gives them a lighter vision, or vice versa. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it does. I mean, I think there's definitely variations in the quality of these things. What is behind it? I don't know. Whether you can boil it down to some subtlety of pharmacokinetics or whatever. I mean, in South America, they have, they have the kind of basic ayahuasca brew, which is Banisteriopsis and Psychotria usually.
Right.
But they also have many other admixtures that they add to change the quality of the thing. Wow. So they can say, well, yeah, we can, brew this one, you'll have blue hallucinations. That one, you'll have red hallucinations, And
let me ask you about the purging aspect of it. We talked about how you can take certain tinctures that could make you not have to purge. What keeps you from not just taking those? Is it just the ritualistic, traditionalistic sense? I mean, because an older gentleman like yourself, I would assume purging isn't the funnest activity. It's not for me, and I'm 31,
Well, it's not, but at the same time, it's a good thing. It's cathartic,
right.
And it is the traditional way. But yeah, I mean, there's a feeling, especially in South American shamanism, the idea that purging is cleansing, and
right.
Getting rid of all the bad energy also involves getting rid of all the bad stuff in your body too.
Right.
It's probably, you could get around it. You could make preparations that are not very purgative, like Pharmahuasca. That's why Pharmahuasca is great, because you get all the benefits of ayahuasca, but none of the pain, but
right.
maybe some of the pain is good. Maybe you need
I was going to say that leads me to question, maybe you don't get all the benefits from Pharmahuasca because, like you said, the pain is good. It's good to cleanse thyself, Yeah,
you do get this feeling that ultimately that's beneficial. So I don't go out of my way to avoid purging. I just figure I've taken enough ayahuasca now that it's kind of, usually with me, it's more or less an option. I don't have to purge.
Okay.
I can keep it down, but usually at some point, if it's a strong brew, I like to get rid of it.
Right.
You feel better if you get rid of it. You don't have the queasy stomach. Sometimes it won't leave.
Right.
You can't purge,
How
it's
long?
Like, no, I'm not leaving. I'm not done here, just relax. I'm kind of like a guest who comes to the party and, camps on your living room floor.
How long do the shamans say to try to hold the brew down for? I mean, because if you puke it up in 10 minutes, aren't you not going to have a good 6-hour experience?
Most of the time, you're not. You should try and keep it down at least an hour.
Okay.
And, there are different variations. And our studies have shown this, there are slow metabolizers and fast metabolizers. A lot of people will be well into it 40 minutes after drinking, an hour after drinking it. Other people, nothing happens for 2 hours.
Right.
I'm one of those. I'm somewhere in between. I mean, it's rare that I would feel anything in an hour. Usually takes at least an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, which is why you want to be cautious about taking a booster. Normally, I don't take a booster. For one thing, if I take a booster, I just throw it up. You know, I mean, the stuff tastes so bad, I can't keep the second dose down anyway, so why waste it?
Right. Well, and we should also discuss a little bit of the safety. There's some concerns with taking some of these inhibitors with certain foods, correct? That's
kind of misinformation. It's a bit complicated. There are clinical MAO inhibitors that are not used very much anymore. I mean, they're an obsolete class of drugs with things like tranylcypromine and iproniazid and these sorts of things. These are irreversible MAO inhibitors. And what they mean by irreversible is they bind to the MAO covalently and they totally inactivate it in your body. You have to completely regenerate new MAO, and that takes a couple of weeks. And it completely knocks out your MAO, and there's two kinds of MAO. There's MAO-A and there's MAO-B. MAO-B is the one that metabolizes tyramine. And compounds like that have this cardiovascular hypertensive effect. And that is found in many foods like cheeses, chocolate, wines, all the things that people used to have to avoid when they were taking these irreversible MAO inhibitors. So it's the so-called cheese effect, right? If you eat these things and you haven't totally cleared the MAO inhibitor out, it can be very dangerous. It raises your blood pressure. You can have a stroke.
Not good. But the Banisteriopsis is a
the beta-carbolines are very selective for MAO-A, and they hardly touch MAO-B. So it's actually safe to take these things with MAO. You know, this is nature, again, being more ingenious than we are. You know, these beta-carbolines are a lot more selective for the MAO-A, and it's MAO-A that metabolizes DMT and these other tryptamines, as well as serotonin. But there's this idea that somehow, you know, this traditional diet that the shamans do is about avoiding these foods that will, you know, cause hypertension. That's not really it. You know, that's not really the reason.
It's probably more of just like, similar to I do a ritual every time I do something, and it usually involves a few hours at least of non-eating, not only to the experience stronger, but also, you know, if anything psychedelics have taught me, it's to take care of this meat body I have. If there's one thing I could point to that they've definitely told me, it's, hey, take care of your body. Don't eat shit. Don't eat processed foods. Try to avoid that. And so I try to stick with a diet, but it's more of a ritualistic thing than it is, you know, experience-wise.
I think the diet in traditional ayahuasca shamanism, you know, is more relevant when you're actually in training to become an ayahuasquero, and you have to do the dieta, but you also have to diet, as they say, with a range of medicinal plants that are not ayahuasca. You know, and in order to do that, you have to get your body clean so that you can, you know, have the tobacco diet or the ajo sacha diet or the chiricsanango diet. These are different plant teachers that you take and learn from in the process of your going through your apprenticeship.
You know? Let me go back for a minute. Most people start psychedelic usage without a real guide or anybody to kind of guide them. It sounds to me like, that was kind of your experience. You just kind of had Terrence there, correct?
We were both about as clueless as we could possibly be. You know, back then. It was the 60s. Nobody knew anything about, you know, traditional uses, or at least we didn't pay attention. I mean, that was kind of what led us both really to appreciate shamanism.
Right.
Because, in the 60s, the only paradigm we had really was Timothy Leary and those people.
Right.
And they had some good ideas, and the importance of set and setting and all that. That's important. I mean, they were psychologists after all.
Right.
But they were as clueless as everybody else.
Right. They were kind of telling people to just go do it. And see, I advocate the use of psychedelic drugs, but I don't advocate the irresponsible use.
I think informed use, and that was the thing. I mean, we discovered early on, Carlos Castaneda.
Right.
Now most of what Carlos Castaneda wrote about is probably bullshit. I mean,
what makes you say that, Dennis?
Well, a lot of his subsequent works, other than the teachings of Don Juan, I think the teachings of Don Juan have some basis in fact.
Okay.
Although but then all this other stuff, it became like a franchise. It became like a book franchise. But what I credit Carlos Castaneda with is making me aware of the fact that there was an indigenous tradition around these things, and I was to the point where I thought, well, this is the most important thing in my world right now. If I want to understand how to use these things, talk to the people that have a tradition of use. Don't talk to, some Harvard psychiatrist who's now, turned into a demagogue or whatever.
Right.
I mean, whatever. I don't disrespect Timothy Leary, but I don't think he was any more. I think he was just feeling this way, as we all were in those days.
Right. Yeah. See, I enjoyed him for what he was, but a lot like you, I read the teachings of Don Juan when I was really young, and it forced me to go look for somebody that knew what the hell they were doing. Because I took mushrooms, I took LSD before I knew what the hell I was doing. And most of it was just clueless. Yeah, I was seeing geometric patterns, but I wasn't downloading any information. I wasn't applying anything to my life. I wasn't able to tell anyone about the experience other than it was fun. Let's go have a good time. I met a guy when I was 16 years old that introduced me to that book and subsequently showed me how to use these things in the proper context. It's not for party. It's not, you see a lot of people drinking and stuff with them and things like that. He said, they're having fun. That's okay to have fun. But if you want to take these things seriously, sit back and listen to them,
Yeah. I mean, I don't really have anything against recreational use. I mean, I think it's okay to have fun. I have nothing against fun. But like you say, if you really want to get to the deep levels of what these things have to teach, then you have to be serious, and you have to pay attention to set and setting, dose and preparation, and all of these things. It's not something to be taken lightly.
Right.
If you really want to get to these levels, I think a lot of people can probably take mushrooms, on a regular basis at light doses. They probably don't even suspect of what's just around the corner.
That's exactly why I mention it, Dennis, is because the area I'm from and familiar with, a lot of people have taken these substances, but nobody can really speak to me on a level that's of any substance, because they're taking them in a set and setting that's a bunch of other people and they're laughing all night, and I'm like, hey, that's okay, that's fun. I don't condone that activity, but let's get a little serious here, because we are in a kind of a state of peril here on Earth, and you need to have fun and live your life, but at the same time, I think that if we all paid a little bit better attention to these plants, maybe we would take care of the Earth a little bit better, and that's kind of the message I'm trying to give people is, hey, we better wake the fuck up, and soon.
Yeah.
And
why do you suppose that psychedelics at these deeper levels seem to come back with exactly that message? This sort of eco-psychology, this realization about our planetary existential situation and our relation with nature. I mean, so many people come back.
I wish I could just say,
experience that.
Right. I agree. And I wish I could just say, oh, it's because people hear about it, and then they interpret it psychologically and they just hear about it. But my own experience was one of, it's not that I didn't care about the earth. I grew up in a beautiful landscape. It's not that I didn't care. I didn't have the deep sympathy until many of my deep LSD and mushroom and, subsequent DMT trips. And that's a question that I wish I knew that I had the answer to, because it does seem like everyone who takes them seriously develops what you're saying, an eco-friendly point.
They come away with this perception of the it's an overused word, but this understanding of the sacredness of nature in a certain way. And I've speculated that, I don't know if you've read anything by Simon Powell.
I don't believe so. What?
He wrote a book called The Psilocybin Solution, and he's written a couple of other interesting books. He is basically what does he call himself? He definitely likes psilocybin as his major teacher. Very interesting fellow. He wrote a book called Darwin's Unfinished Business. That was his second book. His thesis is basically that, nature is inherently intelligent, right? That's why you see these marvelous adaptations in the biological realm.
Right.
This isn't about an intelligent designer, and there's no designer. Nature is the intelligence itself, but you see these elegant solutions on the evolutionary level. That's just because things are put together in a way that makes sense, that is intelligent. And psilocybin it's kind of like a microscope or a telescope. It's a lens through which you can observe nature. And when you observe it through that lens, you realize that, it is intelligent. It's and it leads to the idea that consciousness itself is buried in nature. I don't think that consciousness is something that is confined to the brain. I think the brain has a lot of it, because the brain is a very complex structure, and I've in the same way that gravity, that mass, if you accumulate enough mass in a small enough place, in a small enough volume, you get a black hole, right?
Right.
You accumulate so much mass that it wraps space and time around itself and kind of, disappears from the reference frame. Well, if order or complexity is similar to mass, in the sense that if you accumulate enough mass in a small enough, enough order, enough complexity in a small enough space, like in the human brain,
right,
then you get these emergent properties happening.
Okay.
And I didn't say that very well, but I think you gather
I got it.
What I'm getting at here. So so that's and psilocybin is actually a lens that you can look at the world and see things about it, see relationships, processes, and things that you normally would they would be opaque to you.
Well, see, and I understand that. And back to what you were saying, why does everyone get this similar ecological friendly thing? That tells me that maybe psilocybin is its own conscious being, like you're saying. Because why? I don't know. I guess I don't really know how to phrase it other than, you're looking at the world through a different lens, but we all still interpret things the way we will. Almost everybody I've ever met in my whole life that's taken psychedelics seriously also takes, the earth seriously, as not people that throw trash all over the place, not people that are treating the earth like shit,
Yeah.
And
that's interesting. You can't really do that. It does definitely sort of activate this this reverence for nature, this respect for nature, appreciation of ourselves as natural beings. And this happens to be the message that we need to appreciate and integrate and propagate to everyone we know, because this is what we have to come to understand if we're gonna pull our asses out of the fire.
Well, and for a long time, I was worried that, especially with Fukushima and all the bad stuff that happened, a few years back, I got into nuclear physicist forums and, people 20 times smarter than I am, but I understood that they were really concerned about what happened in Japan. Shortly after that, I watched your talk on how ayahuasca had told you, and I don't know if that was after Fukushima, but how ayahuasca had told you that there was no way that that Earth was gonna let monkeys fuck this shit up. Yeah, I mean, there was no way.
No, that was long before.
Long before, okay. That was
like 93, because
wow.
that was when I took ayahuasca with the UDV.
Okay.
The first and only, well, not the only time I took it with the UDV, but it was after this. That was when I had the whole photosynthesis,
okay. So
revelation and all that.
So you've been pretty confident that even if humans do fuck up shit, that we won't fuck up the Earth per se, unless we absolutely blow it up, which is possible.
Which is possible. No, I'm pretty confident that we won't utterly destroy, life on Earth. We may come close. I'm not so confident that we're going to get out of this. I mean, if you look at the situation, if we went away today, the world would probably be better off.
Right.
The rest of nature in a certain sense. I mean, the homeostatic mechanisms would kick back in. We'd re-achieve equilibrium, and that the Earth is, it tends toward homeostasis.
Right.
There are all these feedback mechanisms that keep things in balance. We have not been able to have enough of an impact on global processes before the 20th century to really destabilize these processes. But now we are, and we are affecting things on a global scale that are pretty fundamental to keeping things in balance, and we don't even see them, I mean, because they're not dramatic, but like things like the acidification of the ozone, of the ocean,
yeah.
The carbon dioxide is being absorbed into the ocean, changing the pH. So this is affecting the food chain at a very fundamental level.
Right.
Or things like, colony collapse in the honeybees. I mean, all the honeybees are disappearing. What a shame. But no, it's more than just a shame. It's a fundamental,
I was going to say, that's
this is serious shit that's going on.
That's my problem, is trying to convey that to other people and let them know that it's fucking serious. There was a wolf shot recently. I don't know if you read about that, Echo the wolf, that got shot in Utah. And it had a collar on it. And wolves play vital roles in ecosystems, a lot like bees do. And I'm telling people, look, you think that it's just one fucking dead wolf or whatever, but the point is wait until we see the collapse. Then you won't be so nonchalant about it. Then you're like, oh shit, maybe we should have paid attention. And I just feel like humans always wait until we're at that, oh, maybe we should have point.
Well, yeah, we're not very good at anticipating, and the thing is, these global planetary processes, they're not fast. I mean, it takes the kind of planning where you have to think 50 years ahead, 100 years ahead, right. 500 years ahead.
Right.
As a culture, we don't do that. I mean, corporations look at the next quarter. Right. And politicians don't even look at the next quarter. They're too busy staring up their own asses. But,
Yeah, I just can't understand that. I have a couple of friends in China, and they watch the sunset and the sunrise on a fucking TV screen.
There you go. Right, because they can't see it outside. Yeah.
But if that's not a sign to wake the hell up, then what the hell is? When you can no longer see the damn sun. I got friends in Los Angeles that can see 5 stars at nighttime. I see thousands where I'm at and they can see 5. And I'm like, doesn't that tell you something about what the hell's going on here? You know, I just think our connection with nature is dwindling due to the way we live in society. And I think that causes a huge problem. And as you said, I'm not as worried about Earth collapsing. I'm worried about my daughter's life and if she wants to have kids, you know?
Yeah, right. Well, and I have a daughter too. And of course, you know, we want good futures for our kids. It just drives me crazy that the politicians are, you know, the people who can really influence things, the movers and shakers, the corporate people, the politicians, the wealthy people, they seem to be less aware than everybody else, and yet they're the ones, you know, if they would wake up, but they're often they're so immersed in, you know, in denial and actually active. It's almost as though being stupid becomes a badge of honor for some of them.
Right.
You know, and that's very dismaying.
It is.
It's very disturbing.
Well, I think, and these are the people that kind of need psychedelics the most in a serious setting.
These are the people who need it the most and the people least likely to ever take it, you know.
That's
so when you look at, you know, okay, what can we do? We're just small people. But I really do feel that getting, you know, teaching people about these medicines, how to use them, how to take them in a serious way, how to learn from them, probably won't do a damn bit of good. But what else can we do? That's one thing that we can do where we can feel like, okay, maybe we're making a small difference.
Well,
enough people do it.
I got to tell you that's one of the main reasons that compelled me to even do a podcast about psychedelics, because growing up, you didn't talk about it. You know, where I was from, it was like you just didn't talk about it. You were so scared. But now, as I told you in some emails, everyone's kind of open and out there, and we're all starting to talk about it. It is starting to change. More people than I've ever seen in my lifetime are talking about it on a regular basis. So maybe we can start to see some kind of change. But that leads me to a question. Do you think that politicians and our government are suppressing these things almost purposely at some point in our thing, or are they totally clueless?
I just think they're more clueless than anything else. Okay. You know, I mean, if they wanted to, if they're trying to suppress them, you know, they're doing a piss poor job, right? I mean, you can't suppress these things, especially the plants, right? I mean, this is the thing. If you want to look at it in a polarized way, you know, and be divisive about it, if the plants are bioweapons in a certain sense. Right. I mean, you know, they don't kill people. What they do is change hearts and minds. They educate people. That's very dangerous for governments, for religions, for corporations, because, you know, it's a message that doesn't fit in with theirs, which is, you know, sit down, shut up, be good, God-fearing consumers, you know.
And that's why I asked that question, because to me it almost seems like they are, if they weren't trying to suppress it, then there would at least be centers of education for these plants. You know, we need to set up some kind of center where we can be educated. I point everyone to you because you're not totally against the recreational use, because they're so used to one side or the other. Most scientists don't do these things without a psychotherapist, or the other side, government, don't do them at all.
Don't do them at all. Yeah. No, I think the plants themselves are the best teachers.
Right.
You know, there's no substitute for actually having the direct experience with the plant. You know, setting, shamanism, psychotherapy, all of these things are just context for it. Ultimately, the rubber meets the road when you, the person, and the plant, the mushroom, or whatever are in this direct dialogue. That's where the good information comes from.
Right.
And of course, you want to be cautious. You want to, you know, be educated, make informed choices about what to take, how to take it, under what circumstances. But ultimately, that's where the lesson comes from. And that's why there's such, I think, such such interest in essentially in keeping people from having these experiences.
Right.
Because they're threatening to the status quo. Like Terence used to say, they make you have funny ideas. And funny ideas are dangerous.
Yep.
And that's why they're funny, and that's why they're valuable too.
Right. Speaking of lessons in teaching, what is it you teach at the University of Minnesota, correct?
Yeah.
And what is your class entail, and is there a way that people can enroll in that?
People can. All my classes are online now. This is the beginning of a trend that this is what they want to do. They want to put all the classes online. So, okay, I went along with that. I like it in some ways because I can do it from anywhere, and potentially I can get to a larger audience. I dislike it in other ways because there's really very little personal contact with students.
Right.
And I like personal contact. I like interacting with students, and I can do it with Google Hangout or whatever, but it's just not the same,
Right.
But I teach those courses, and technically anybody could sign up for them because they are online. I mean, you'd have to register with the University of Minnesota, which you could do, and sign up for the courses and, get the credit, and you don't have to live in Minnesota to do it. I have students from other universities that take these courses.
Wow, that is interesting. And
I teach 2 courses there. This is in the Center for Spirituality and Healing,
right,
which is the alternative medicine program. It's not a New Age cult. It just sounds like one, but but that's what they call them. And I teach ethnopharmacology, a course called People, Plants, and Drugs, ethnopharmacology, and another one called Botanical Medicines, which is more not as edgy as ethnopharmacology. I don't talk about psychedelics that much. I just talk about other medicinal plants. And we have taught courses before during the January intersession called Plants and Human Affairs, which is like an intensive 2-week course. But we taught that in Hawaii every January for quite a number of years, but we don't do that anymore for reasons that are complicated.
Uh-huh. Okay. Speaking of Hawaii, you mentioned Hawaii. Kat had established, Terence's former wife, and you, I believe, had established a digitized photo or a digitized specimen gallery of
We were involved in a project to digitize this herbarium in South America at the Universidad Nacional Amazonia Peruana in Iquitos. We got a grant to do that. And the idea was to scan all these specimens, put them online, and essentially make that, hook those specimens into other databases.
Right.
And make that a resource for anybody with an interest in Amazonian ethnomedicine or Amazonian botany for that matter. But about the time that we got that grant and started working on that, Kat decided to ostracize me from the family, so I don't know if that project ever went anywhere or not.
Okay.
She's I'm dead to her now. So
still at this point?
Guess so.
Wow. That must be difficult.
Well, it hurts, but I made efforts to reach out, and I've gotten nothing back. So,
what can you do? Yep.
What can you do?
You're right.
Unfortunately, I don't think this project ever really got anywhere.
Well, it sounds interesting because it
was very interesting, but she managed to waste. Well, I don't know if it was wasted. I can't really say that, but we got a $300,000 grant we should have been able to get farther with it, but I was not in charge, and I don't know whether she's made any progress with it or not. She doesn't give me any updates anymore, unfortunately.
Well, I looked around for it after reading your book. I've read through your book a couple times now, and I was not able to find much. I read on I think it was a tropics.org or something. It was a similar
Tropicos.
Okay.
Yeah.
A similar database of plants, but I haven't seen nothing from her. But anyway, we'll switch gears here. You mentioned that.
Well, just to mention Tropicos. Yeah, Tropicos is the University of the Missouri Botanical Garden database, which is Missouri Botanical Garden is maybe the biggest, most important herbarium for neotropical New World botany.
Right.
So incredible collections, and most of their collections are digitized. So that's a great resource for somebody. Tropicos.org.
Are you worried, before we switch gears here, are you worried at all that we're wiping species off the planet before we are able to find them?
Well, there's no doubt that we are.
Global pollution and things like that as well.
Yeah, we are in the biggest extinction period in millions of years. I mean, the most, at various points in the history of life on Earth, we've come to a situation where we've, not we, but circumstances claim, environmental change has at times wiped out 90% of everything on the planet. Well, we're not quite there, but in terms of the rate of species extinction, we're in a very high period now. I mean, we're losing dozens per day.
That's why I think these herbariums are so important, to keep some of these species intact, because I know that, we worry about there being very little of some plants, trees, different types of things. Speaking of trees, have you ever tried kratom at all?
I have not worked with kratom.
Because I told you I injured my back about a year and a half ago, and pharmaceutical drugs, they always have side effects. There's always some bullshit going on. So I tried the leaves of kratom, the ground up leaves of kratom, and I got to attest to that to anybody that's listening that's on any opiate drugs that they work.
It definitely works.
Definitely works. I mean, you get a tolerance to them like anything else, but if you use them in combination with other pain relieving things, and try to keep switching it up, you can actually heal some pretty major pain.
Is it hard to get off it if you do get on it?
I didn't find any. There's been reports on Arrowhead about some minor withdrawals, but in comparison to the synthetic opiates that they give you from the pharmacy, it's relatively zero. But I have read reports. My personal experience was no. I used a little bit of cannabis. I used a little bit of different things. Psychedelics, of course, definitely help just with your mental state. But I wanted to mention to you,
I haven't worked with kratom. I haven't, and yet I haven't bothered to really get into it. How do you take it? Do you take it as a capsule, or
I take it as just the toss and wash method. I grind it up as because you could either get the leaves or you could get them ground. And I take it just ground up as much as possible, put a bunch, 5 grams or so in my hand, toss it down the hatch, and then drink some orange juice or something,
I see.
But you can take it in capsules too. I've heard different people take it in different ways. I don't know if it's smokable at all, but
I understand it is smokable. I thought about one could make a tincture out of it. The material I have is some kind of an extract, and I was thinking I'll just make a tincture out of it and try it that way. I haven't gotten around to it yet.
All right. Well, let me know when you do.
I think it's one of those useful plants, for pain reliever. I'm wondering if I should plug in here. See my battery's getting a little low.
Uh-oh.
Can you give me a minute? I'll get the cord.
No problem, Dennis. No problem.
All right. Hang on. I think these video programs suck the power. I was 100% when we started.
Oh, they definitely do. I tell people, don't use them on tablets or your tablet's dead in about 20 minutes, you know?
Yeah.
Well, back to it. You mentioned in the book that it took you a while to trust yourself again with psychedelics, your words. How long was it between La Chorrera and the time where you took psychedelics again?
Well, it wasn't that long, actually. Let me see. It was about a year, actually.
And was it mushrooms that you took, or
it was peyote?
Oh, okay.
I took some peyote. That was before we figured out how to grow mushrooms. So this was like 1972.
Okay.
So that was about a year after La Chorrera. And I took peyote, and it was great. It was fine. So then I thought, well, okay, maybe I can take them again. You know,
Right.
It was a perfectly reasonable psychedelic experience. And
well, because I remember your account of when you took ayahuasca again, about how it didn't seem to affect you when you studied it, and it didn't seem to give you that much of an effect. It was years later when you went back to the Amazon, and you had wondered why. You had wondered if maybe the brew was not that strong, and you took it back to the lab and tested it, and the brew was strong enough. It just wasn't affecting you. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think it was a combination of things. I was down there. That was when I was doing my field work on ayahuasca in 1981, and I was down there. I think it was a combination of I was a stranger in a strange land. I was very much into maintaining control. In a certain, and not losing it. It was almost like a personal quest, because like 1971, I go down with Terrence. I completely, we blow out all the gaskets, and it's practically a disaster. We got through it, but it could have been much worse.
Yeah.
And so then 10 years later, I was sort of like, I went down to South America on my own. And I was very invested in the idea that, okay, I can go to South America. I can do good science. I do not have to go crazy.
Right.
And I was very much invested in the idea of not going crazy. So I took these things, but I was probably a bit too tight-assed to go, basically, and I didn't. My companion who was traveling with me, Don McCrae, this other graduate student, who had no experience with psychedelics before we went down there together. He was actually a fairly straight-laced guy, until I got a hold of him, and then, and we went down there together, and he was taking ayahuasca, and he was, completely all over the place. And I was like, nah, not so much.
One has to wonder how many friends you've corrupted in your years.
Not nearly enough.
Well, when you went down there, I don't know if it was later on. You mentioned that when you were in Iquitos in 2011, you felt that old age had set in. You were in a hotel room, I believe. What are your reflections on that now, and do you still feel that?
Well, yeah. You do feel your age after a while. I'm getting old enough that various things are coming up. Like not major health problems, but just enough to remind you that you're not a spring chicken anymore.
Right.
Like a year ago, I got this condition called plantar fasciitis. I don't know if you've ever had that. It shows up overnight. You wake up and, suddenly you're crippled. It's the damnedest thing. So that's a reminder that, you're getting old and you're not Superman anymore. Or
I've never had plantar fasciitis, but due to this back injury I had, it made the nerves in my feet made me feel my plantar fascia, right? Which I've never felt before. And like you said, some days it's impossible to even walk on it. It's ridiculous. But I guess my question was more leaning towards, I mean, that's the physical aspect. What about the mental? Do you find that the fire still burns as hot in you as it did in 1971 when you were that young, ready to explore, kid, for lack of a better word?
It's hard to say. It's a tough question.
Right.
I think it does. I mean, I think what I had then was enthusiasm without any real experience or without an experience, and hopefully the wisdom that comes with experience. So I'm that much older now, so I'm still enthusiastic. I still believe in psychedelics. I do not feel that I don't feel a mission necessarily to take every psychedelic that comes my way. I mean, I figure I work with a few of the plant teachers, mostly mushrooms and ayahuasca.
Right.
I've got so much to learn from those that I don't need to, try all the Shulgin compounds. I mean, I might try something like that if somebody says it's exceptionally good, but I'm still learning from my plant teachers. And, oddly enough, what you learn after 30 years, 40 years of doing this is that you don't know anything.
Right.
I mean, that's the lesson. You don't know shit. Ayahuasca always emphasizes this to me. Never forget that you don't know shit.
Yeah,
okay.
I've had very few experiences with ayahuasca. It was mostly mushrooms, LSD, things like that. But I thought that I knew something even then. And then the first time I took ayahuasca, before I even heard you say that was the exact message. Zach, you know next to nothing, or basically nothing, and you are nothing, basically.
Right.
Right. You're a speck.
And that's very liberating in a way, because it was like, okay, you actually don't know anything, so you don't have to pretend to know anything.
Right.
And you can be quite open about that, and you can say, and this is actually the beginning of wisdom, because if you think you know something, then that's a block to learning stuff. So it's like you clear the decks, you admit that we know just a tiny fraction of what is really going on. So there's all this stuff to be learned. There are lifetimes of learning, and I welcome that. That's liberating almost.
That's amazing to hear in such a man with your credentials, because do you find that your contemporaries and your colleagues, do you find that some of them don't have that? And do you find that a little...
Well, sure. I mean, a lot of people in academics or in any field, you devote your life to studying something. If you're in science or whatever, I mean, the chief... and then you tend to think, well, actually, we know quite a bit, and I'm a very accomplished person in my field, all of which is true, but never forget, it's a tiny fraction of what there is to be known. And I do believe a lot of scientists, could benefit from taking psychedelics, or just reflecting on the fact that, science is a very limited it's a powerful but a limited way to understand the world, and you have to be cognizant of its limitations.
Right.
That's really important. So I think that's a lesson that's that's worth taking to heart. And I've said in some of my when I was an undergraduate, I had an interdisciplinary major, so it was anthropology, biology, and philosophy of science, right? And I have never regretted taking this philosophy of science. I think all scientists should be required to do that, because they never think about what they're doing, right? I mean, science becomes this rote thing. What is the purpose of science? Well, the purpose of science is to get grants and publish papers and have graduate students and, play this game of science. And they get all bogged down in that. And they lose sight of what the real purpose of science is. it's the search for truth.
Right.
See, it's the most powerful method we have to actually ask questions of the universe that you can verify and, you can test. And that's the essence of science.
That makes me wonder, being an avid Terence McKenna follower as well as Dennis McKenna, it makes me wonder if that's why Terence turned away a little bit from science, because it seems like you guys had a little rivalry there just because he kind of turned away from science. But I can see his point of view on why he did, because science is so, and scientists, as we just described, some of them are so know-it-all, so non-humble, that it's like, oh, get out of here with you know-it-all bullshit,
There was an element of that, for sure. I mean, but the thing is, he was ready, after La Chirera, he was pretty much ready to reject science out of hand.
Okay.
And he said, well, science is never going to explain what happened to us.
Right.
So the whole enterprise of science is, corrupt, and it has no value to explain this. And I was saying, well, wait a minute, we can't really say that, because for one thing, we're not scientists.
Right.
We have to learn how to do science. We actually have to become scientists in order to fully appreciate the limitations of it and also the usefulness of it. So he was a little quick to jump the gun, and I was saying, well, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. There's a lot about science that's useful. We just have to realize it's not the, it has its own limitations.
And do you think that science did help you explain some of what happened at La Chirera?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it taught me a way of thinking that was useful. And I think that, it helps to ground a person in a certain way, because you approach phenomena, with a very critical eye, and an eye to the idea of, science is a way of asking questions of nature and getting answers back that you can test.
Right.
And you can verify it. So there's no other thing that does that. I mean, religions don't do that. In fact, they don't want you to ask questions. They say, this is the dogma, this is the faith, you must have faith, you must accept what we say, and if you don't, then you're a heretic, you're a bad person. Science has to encourage heresy.
I kind of find irony in the religious teachings, though, considering that tracing most of them back, it seems like many of them could have been psychedelic cults in the first place.
Well, they were psychedelic cults in the first place, but they're so far away from that. They're completely invested in denying that was ever part of it, and making sure that none of their members ever have anything like a genuine mystical experience.
Right.
With some exceptions. I mean, some religions encourage it. You get this funny combination of, an institution like the UDV and the Santo Daime, very religious, very dogmatic and top down and all that, and yet somehow they've integrated this psychedelic, experience at the heart of their practice.
Right.
But even when you go to the temple and take ayahuasca, in this group of 500 people or whatever, they don't want you to sit back in your chair and go inside. They want you to pay attention.
They want you to hear their teaching.
They want you to hear their teaching, and they use the medicine, put you in a very suggestible place.
That sounds like brainwashing to me. If I did,
well, it is a kind of brainwashing. But fortunately, the values that they're advocating are things that we all agree with, pretty much. Right. That you should be a good person, that you should treat people well.
Right.
The UDV has got, like all religion, they've got their issues. They're not all, they're not totally equality minded when it comes to women, and they have issues about gays and all this stuff. Like religions do, and that is really a reflection of their probably Christian roots. These things basically are kind of hybrid forms of Christianity or mutant forms of Christianity. They borrow heavily from Christianity. But, and the other thing I think that Terence was, his reaction against science was, in later years, when he had the whole time wave idea and that whole thing that he was about, it used to bother him that I was a critic of the time wave, and we'd have these long discussions, and I would say, the problem with the time wave is it's not a theory, and it's not a theory because you can't test it. You cannot state the criteria that will invalidate this idea.
Right.
So it's not a scientific theory. Call it something else. Call it, I don't know, it's a beautiful, weird, strange idea. It's not a scientific theory.
Similar to why your guys' ritual at La Chorrera wasn't an experiment, right? That's a similar...
It was not an experiment, right. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about the tincture of hemlock, Dennis? You mentioned that. Do you have that? And what is the mechanism of action behind that?
No, have I made a tincture of hemlock?
Yes.
To have it on the shelf when the time comes to check out?
Right.
I have to honestly tell you I haven't done that yet. I haven't gotten around to it, which maybe means I don't plan to check out anytime soon.
Right. But you still feel like you want to go out under your own power before someone has to absolutely take care of you and change your diaper?
I don't know. It depends. It's going to depend on when it comes,
Right.
But I think that people do, people have this idea that they're going to be able to, make a clear decision at some point to end it.
Right.
But by the time they get to that point, any chance to make a decision on their own has been taken out of their hands.
Exactly. And
so I don't know.
What is it about hemlock that made you say that, though? I mean,
Well, Socrates, if it's good enough for Socrates, it's good enough for me, right? And Socrates is actually, he was executed by drinking hemlock, and hemlock is a great way to go.
It's pretty quick and painless, basically?
Not so much quick, but it's painless.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a slow paralysis. I mean, I'm not speaking from experience here, obviously. Right. But it's a slow paralysis where you just, basically it kind of creeps over you, and eventually your respiratory functions cease, and you go very, very peacefully.
Right. Well, that sounds interesting, because I often wondered that about myself. I don't want to get to the point where my daughter or someone has to absolutely take care of me. I've been disabled before in my life, and it's really hard on the people around you, so I think that I'd like to take that way out. Switching subjects a little bit, you said that you've always been a sky watcher, correct? Since Paonia, you've always looked at the sky and the stars.
Yeah. I've had an interest in astronomy. I mean, if I hadn't got into psychedelics, I probably would have gone into astrophysics. That was my ambition, but I didn't have the math for it anyway. So,
do you still get into it though as a hobby?
Not so much.
Really?
I mean, I don't go out and take the telescope out and look, but when I'm in a place where you can see the constellations and so on, I definitely spend some time doing that. And of course, now we have apps for this, right? So if you have the internet, you can take your iPad and shine it up against the sky, and it will show you what you're looking at.
Not fun. Not as fun, I would say.
Not as fun, but certainly educational.
Yeah, it is. Well, see, because I'm an avid sky watcher myself, and I really enjoy meteor showers. I saw the Great Leonid Storm of 2001, which was about 3,000 an hour.
Wow.
It looked like you were traveling through space, similar to a psychedelic experience. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like, oh my God, am I alive? Am I dead? What the hell is going on?
I love meteor showers. I like sky watching in that sense. And, if you ever get a chance to, have you ever been to Hawaii?
I have not, no.
Okay, well, if you ever get a chance, go to the Big Island.
Okay.
Go to Mauna Kea, which is where all the big telescopes are. The biggest telescopes. It's about 14,000 feet there. Oh, wow. If you go up there at night, actually they won't let you go higher than the visitor center, but it's still high enough. It's about 9,000 feet. If you go up there at night, it's just unbelievable. I mean, you will be convinced that you're in the middle of space,
Right.
I mean, it's unfucking believable.
my friends come and visit down here from Denver, and we're in a place of low light pollution. Our nearest big town is Pueblo, Colorado, and there's 150,000 people there. So our light pollution is so minimal from every side that I tell people, you haven't seen the sky. If you've been living in Denver or Colorado Springs or any city, you've never actually seen the sky. Down here, I live at an elevation of, it's like 7,000 feet here, but 20 miles south, I could get to about 9,500 feet. And up there, it's just crystal clear air, crystal clear skies. Unfucking believable, as you said.
Right. So you don't need to go to Hawaii. You get that where you are.
Yeah, I do, but I still have great interest in Hawaii because I've never been to an island at all. So
it's a great place. One of the great power centers of the world is Hawaii. I lived there for 3 years when I was studying for my master's, and then various times off and on after that. Yeah, it's a wonderful place.
You mentioned that you smelled a tree in Hawaii that smelled like DMT. Did it smell like burning DMT?
It smelled like the DMT we used to get back in the 60s, which was this orange paste which smelled horrible. I mean, it smelled, and the reason is they were lousy syntheses, right? There was all these precursors and so on. People didn't bother to clean it up.
Right.
Pure DMT is a white powder that has no odor.
Right.
But this stuff was very aromatic, and this tree smelled exactly like DMT, but it was not.
Have you smelled one since that was like that? A different type of species, or no? That was it.
No, that was pretty much it.
Wow. Speaking of precursors, before I don't want to take too much of your time here. Hopefully we could do this again in the future, but
sure.
I wanted to ask you about taking supplements. A lot of people are taking supplements. Do you yourself take any, first off?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you believe that taking so like, for example, if someone has a hard time sleeping, a lot of people tell them take melatonin. Well, from what I've learned about chemistry, it's better to take the precursor. Would that be a correct thing to tell them? So it would be better to take tryptophan or something that would later down the line convert to melatonin than to actually take the melatonin itself?
Well, melatonin, you could take melatonin. Okay. I mean, you could take tryptophan, which is kind of your own natural sedative. I'm not even sure you could still buy tryptophan. There was
I take
they took it off the market, but
I take L-tryptophan. L-tryptophan. I don't know if it's
L-tryptophan is just that's the chirality. So all the amino acids are L or D,
right,
right-handed or left-handed.
Right.
So L-tryptophan is just tryptophan.
Okay, that's what I wondered.
But some people take 5-HTP, which is 5-hydroxytryptophan. So it's just that much closer to serotonin, right? Because serotonin is 5-hydroxytryptamine.
Right.
So if you have tryptophan, then you hydroxylate it, you got 5-hydroxytryptophan, then you remove the acid group, the carboxyl group, and turn it into tryptamine.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess my thing was, so there's not a huge difference between taking the earlier precursors and taking the actual, because 5-HTP is closer to serotonin than tryptophan is.
Yeah, but yes, that's right. It's closer to serotonin, but here's the thing, and it's not totally I'm not sure I completely understand it. Okay. People take 5-HTP because it's a precursor to serotonin.
Right.
But the problem is 5-HTP probably doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier as easily as tryptophan does.
Right, okay.
Because just like psilocybin or bufotenine, you've got that oxygen out there on the 5 position of the indole ring. It's charged at physiological pH. It's a minus charge, and it may not be taken through the blood-brain barrier because the blood-brain barrier likes to take neutral things up.
Okay.
So it's, nothing's ever simple in biology. So the question is, tryptophan would be converted in the brain to 5-hydroxytryptophan and then to serotonin. But the question is, we know tryptophan is actively transported into the brain, as is DMT, by the way.
Right.
It's rare for something like that to be actively transported. So once it gets into the brain, then it would go to the next step. So sometimes it makes sense to take a precursor.
Okay. That's what I basically wanted to know, basically from my own personal knowledge, because it seemed like when I took melatonin, I wasn't getting what, the tired, let's go to sleep, and I tried it at different times of the day. But when I started taking the tryptophan, I was starting to get a better cycle of sleep and wake and, a lot better. It just seems like the tryptophan affects me a lot more than the melatonin does. Doing a little research on that, that's what I came up with. So
then that's what you should do. You should do what works.
Right.
This isn't an exact science. I also I find that valerian is good for me. Sometimes I take kava, and actually a combination of valerian and kava is pretty good for sleeping.
Pretty sedative. I agree. Have you ever taken kava with LSD?
I have not taken it with LSD.
I don't know if there's a synergy there or what it is, but I don't even remember where I heard it. I just know that I've taken it at the height of an LSD trip, and talk about an experience. Short lasting, but as soon as the kava tincture or tea or whatever it may be hits your mouth, it's basically a whole numbness throughout the body that persists for about 5 minutes maximum. But it definitely something to it. I've had friends try it. I've had multiple people try it. There's definitely something there, but I've never figured out the chemistry of it. It's just been a self-experiment,
Well, kava will make your mouth numb.
Yes. And I think that maybe, I thought that at first that LSD just heightens your senses, of course. And so that's what I thought it was. But compared to taking it without the LSD, there's definitely something there, in my opinion, at least.
That's interesting. I don't know what that might be.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't doubt it. I can speculate what might cause it, but
it could be goddamn placebo, as we talked about. Placebo is so strong that you could almost convince yourself that anything does something.
But it's a real effect. It doesn't. If you take kava by itself, it doesn't do that.
No.
If you take LSD by itself, you don't get this effect. So there's probably a synergism of some kind there.
Okay.
It's quite possible because partly the enzymes that metabolize LSD and the enzymes that metabolize kava are the same, right? These are not MAOs. These are different set of enzymes, the so-called cytochrome P450s, which metabolize 95% of the drugs you put in your body. There's a whole family of these enzymes. It's kind of the built-in detoxification mechanism of the liver. So most of these things, that's why you have to be concerned with, like drug and herb interactions.
Right.
You're taking supplements and pharmaceuticals because these things interfere with each other.
Right. I always see warnings of even things like grapefruit with something as simple as Valium. They don't.
Yeah, exactly. And usually these things actually lower the effectiveness of the pharmaceuticals. So it's not like you're in danger of overdosing. There's a couple of exceptions. Usually it just means that if you're taking, say, garlic, and you happen to be taking one of the HIV drugs, for example, I forget which one it is, but not that you have AIDS or you would be taking it, but just theoretically, anyway, if you're taking that, you have to up the dose because it's not as bioavailable if you're taking like grapefruit juice or garlic. A lot of these things interfere with absorption of these things.
By the way, you mentioned HIV medication. Have you watched that Hamilton Morris's? Are you familiar with his work?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I'm aware that there are some HIV medicines that they smoke them and
yes. He's got that really interesting series, Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, on YouTube, and it's definitely worth checking out, But back to LSD for a second. In your day, there was a variety of LSD. There was orange sunshine, window pane, blue dot, whatever the hell else. Nowadays, not so much. Did you notice a difference? I don't know how much LSD you took, but did you notice a big difference in the kind of acid, or did you think it was more just the dosage dependent?
Well, I think it was the dose. I think what there was back in the day was LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. I think that was pretty much what there was, but there was very big differences in dosage.
Okay.
Now, of course, there are lots of lysergic acid derivatives that, as well as other derivatives, the designer drugs, the ALADs and the FLADs and all this stuff.
Right.
Dave Nichols calls them his lads. He invented most of these.
His lads, I like that. What about LSA? Your morning glory experiences, are they how similar? I've eaten morning glory seeds twice, and I found them to be a little bit harder to deal with than LSD physically.
They are harder to deal with physically, and that's probably mostly because other things in the morning glory seeds.
Okay.
Not so much the alkaloids, and then they're a different effect. They're definitely psychoactive. The best experiences I've had with morning glories are baby Hawaiian wood rose.
Okay.
If you know Hawaiian wood rose.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah. So that's 8 to 12 seeds is pretty much a sufficient dose.
And that was the less physical that you've ever felt on them? the less physically constraining that you...
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I didn't. I took some of the other kind a few times, once or twice. The Ipomea, which you have to take about 300 to 600 seeds.
Right.
That's hard to get down, cause nausea. But baby Hawaiian wood rose is, a few seeds, and it's a pretty solid psychedelic. And I'm surprised it's not more popular.
Me too, but it also could be because people don't really know, like your early experience where you took 25 of them first time.
There is that. Yeah, I wouldn't want to repeat that. That's right. Again, it's a case of being clueless.
What about Datura? Do you see this as any kind of medical use at all? Other than the scopolamines used to dilate eyes, things like that. Do you see the Datura experience as useful in any way?
Well, the medical uses of Datura and scopolamine, right?
Right.
For nausea, for pain, actually. It induces a kind of hypnotic state.
Dilation of eyes, right?
And it's used for that, although they used atropine more than, or a synthetic. They use atropine, but same thing. Actually, Hamilton Morris has a good episode about Bergmansia called... about it's being used in Colombia as a date rape drug primarily, or a drug. Have you seen that?
I believe I did see that one. I believe so.
It's on YouTube. It's called The World's Most Dangerous Drug.
Yes. It was part of his Pharmacopoeia series.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Very interesting. I just looked at that the other day. Pretty interesting thing. I didn't know it was being used that way, but I'm not surprised. It's always been used as a power drug and as a drug in witchcraft to, get control of people. And I didn't realize it was quite so straightforward, but
right.
It is used that way. I read recently there was an interesting study that there's interest in things like ketamine right now that cause a abrupt cessation of depression. It has been used that way. The SSRI type antidepressants take 2 or 3 weeks to really kick in, but some recent work with ketamine showed that it interrupts depression essentially immediately, and it's a lasting effect. There was a similar paper published with scopolamine not too long ago that showed it had a similar effect. It interrupted depression. So I think that's an interesting.
That is interesting. I gotta say, as a forward, I don't advise people take Datura because the one experience I had with it wasn't exactly anything.
No, people should not. No, people should not take it. I mean, it's actually fairly dangerous. It's toxic for one thing. You have to take quite a lot to get to those levels, but it's dangerous in that sense. And then it's dangerous because, it basically produces a profound estrangement from reality. And, you don't know what the fuck you're going.
Right. Well, and then some memory loss too, correct?
Memory loss as well.
That's why I was wondering if in modern medicine, if they ever tried to use it, or if in maybe not so modern, if they ever tried to use it during surgeries or things where they wanted people.
Yes, they do. They do that. In fact, back in the 50s, which was kind of a barbaric time when it come to the way they handled childbirth and all this. But women were put into a scopolamine stupor when they were in labor, basically to totally divorce them from the experience of having the child. It just happened in a different reality. And so they didn't remember. They didn't remember any of the trauma of having childbirth. Plus, it does relieve pain. I mean, interestingly, when I was when was it? I got 8 days up the Amazon, up the Rio Marañón in 2012. I was in Iquitos. I was in the jungle on this boat. I was teaching a bunch of pharmacy students, and so I get a kidney stone, right?
Ooh.
And that wasn't fun.
Oof.
Finally went back, got myself back to Iquitos and got to a hospital. And what do you know? They gave me scopolamine IV as a pain reliever.
Wow.
And it really worked.
Really worked, huh?
Really worked.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You mentioned ketamine. Have you had any experiences with ketamine yourself?
Very limited.
No.
I took it once and didn't like it. Have you worked with it much? I mean, no, I know people that
I've taken it once myself, and what it reminded me of was kind of the 5-MeO DMT in the fact that it was like an empty space and there was nobody there. And I don't even know if I was there, It was just a little too odd for me. I like some company, Mushrooms, LSD, everything's always given me company. And ketamine and, like I said, the other stuff definitely, the 5-MeO definitely gave me the headspace of like I didn't know where I was.
Yeah, it's the void, right?
I don't like that. I don't know, but I also read that tryptamine palace that you recommended on Joe Rogan Experience, and it seems like some people say that there's a lot to be learned from that headspace. I think there is. I mean, I think there is a lot to be learned. Everybody has, like Salvia Divinorum is another good example. Most people don't like it. It's just too bizarre. Right.
But some people like it and learn from it, and from them, more power to them. I mean, I think that all of these sort of states of mind are valuable just in terms of trying to map out what is the spectrum of, of conscious experience.
Right.
what's the cartography, if you want to put it that way, of inner space. So these are interesting tools for exploring that, but it takes braver people than I to go into the, salvia place again and again and again. I have taken it several times, but after a while, it's like, what am I getting out of this? I'm not bringing back any gnosis.
Right. Yeah, that was exactly how I felt. I had some friends who were really into salvia, and it was like, I'm not even sure we had any fun during it, to be honest, because I don't really remember much of it. And then it was just weird, and then I wasn't bringing back nothing, and I'd just come back to myself, and then I'm just weird because what the hell just happened?
So what were your friends getting out of it?
I couldn't tell you because they never explained anything to me that drew them to it either, but they always kept going back to it. They would keep going back to it. I guess they enjoyed something about it. I didn't find the physical effects to be pleasurable. I didn't find my mental state to be pleasurable. I did it maybe 4 times in my life, and I pretty much wrote it off as that's not the one for me,
Yeah.
Where I differ that in DMT was, at least with DMT, the experience of blasting. I mean, I've never gone too deep with DMT, but the experience of kind of blasting off into the cosmos was at least exhilarating to me. With salvia, I never got that exhilaration, even mentally, in the moment, So I didn't work with it too much. What about telepathy, Dennis? I know that what is it? Harmine is called telepathine, or is it harmaline? Which one was called telepathine?
Well, it was harmine.
Okay,
but harmine. I mean, this is you're going back into the kind of the chemical history of the study of these compounds. Harmine was isolated from Paganum harmala before anybody'd heard of ayahuasca, right? I mean, it was known from Paganum harmala, the structure was determined, and it was named harmine, obviously, after Paganum harmala. And then years later, people started looking at Banisteriopsis, and they started isolating alkaloids from it, and they didn't know that they were harmine. They gave them different names like telepathine and benisterine, and I think those were the main 2. At the end of the day, they all turned out to be harmine.
Okay.
But when they isolated it, they couldn't really determine the structure, so they didn't have the instrumentation.
I was just going to ask you, have you had other telepathic experiences besides the ones with your brother, with other people, girlfriends or friends?
Yeah, I have. I mean, mushrooms will reliably do that.
Yeah, I agree with that, but that's hard to tell somebody without sounding batshit crazy.
Well, again, it's one of these things where you sit down, shut up, eat the stuff, see for yourself.
Yeah, pay attention,
Yeah, pay attention. I mean, there's no convincing people.
Right.
They just basically have to belly up to the bar and take it and see what happens.
But what I find so hilarious is that people will get intoxicated out of their mind on alcohol to where they can't even see or know or remember what they're doing, but they're terrified to take 2 grams of mushrooms.
Yeah.
I run into that often.
They have no idea. I mean, it's completely new to them.
Right.
So they're terrified.
Right. That's how it seems. Well, Dennis, I want to
Did we lose our bandwidth?
It seems like we've lost something. Okay, now we're back.
Okay, yeah, you froze up there.
Yeah, so did you. But, I've taken enough of your time for today. I hope we could do this again sometime in the coming months. I have a million more things to talk to you about. I appreciate you letting me pick your brain for a while. One thing I wanted to tell you before we go is that similar to how you got to Richard Schulte's, is how I feel my experience has kind of been with you. Seriously, it's just been, you've been a guy who I laid out on the side of the road dying, and I was cognizant of you and Terrence. Thanks to your books, thanks to a lot of things, I never felt completely alone at a time where nobody was around. And so just a personal thank you from me to you, not just for this podcast, but for our constant communication. I really appreciate it, Dennis.
Well, that's very kind of you. And I'm glad we were able to help you on this near-death experience. Nothing like this has ever happened to me. I can only imagine, well, like you say, drug experiences. That's as close as I've ever come.
Right.
But don't compare me to Schultes. I mean, Schultes is God.
Well, but he was God
I'm just
to you.
a minor deity.
Yeah, but he was God to you in your time. I read about Schultes and things like that, but when I was growing up, it was you and Terrence. You know what I mean? That Schultes was long gone by then. But you said you had never had a near-death experience, but I got to ask you about your wreck on your bicycle. You broke your pelvis, or you fractured it, correct? Hairline fracture of your pelvis.
Yes, yeah.
And I just got to let the audience know that you stayed, 10 days in Vancouver General?
Oops. Hello?
Hello, I'm still here. Hello.
Yeah.
Oh, you stayed 10 days in Vancouver General after you broke your hip, 10, 14 days, something like that?
That's right.
And your hospital bill, just to let everyone know, was $7.50.
Yes.
Okay, in comparison, I got in a wreck 10 miles from the spot I'm at right now, and I'm about 2 miles away from the hospital. They charged me $380 just for a ride from 10 miles down the street to the hospital.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, don't let anybody tell you that the Canadian health care system is dysfunctional. It actually, sure, it's not perfect, but it works pretty darn well.
Right.
You get excellent care. I mean, okay, you need a knee replacement. You might have to wait a while for that, but you will get it eventually. Right. If you need something on an emergency basis, you're going to get excellent care up there. And yeah, $7.50, I think, which was mostly for like the Kleenex I used or some damn thing like that.
That's unbelievable. I stayed 6 days. And 3 of them were in ICU, and my hospital bill was $50,000. I mean,
you have insurance?
I didn't at the time. I had to get on the indigent care program or whatever it was at the time, and they paid for some of it, but it left a large bill that loomed over my head for many years, So I just wanted to say shout out to the Canadians, because their healthcare system seems a lot better than ours,
Yeah, well, they've had it since 1962, so it's been a settled issue there. I mean, in some ways, we ought to look at Canada. They're a much more common sense kind of outfit. A lot of the issues that divide our country are not even issues there.
Right. That's how it seems. Well, I can't wait I'm looking forward to another conversation with you, Dennis. Thank you very much for this, and I hope your day is excellent, and I wish you well on all your surgery and everything you got coming up, sir.
Okay. All right. Keep me posted. Have a great day. It's been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, and I'll make sure I include all your websites, Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, Hefter.org. We didn't really get a chance to touch on a bunch of things I wanted to, so, maybe in a few months we could catch up again.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Dennis. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.